Thank you for joining On Transcendence, a podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Travis. Dr. Travis was born in upstate New York and matriculated to college at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, where he studied design and environmental analysis. Dr. Travis received his master's and PhD in psychology from Maharishi International University in 1988. He was awarded a postdoctoral fellowship investigating sleep with the famed Erwin Feinberg at the Veterans Administration in Martinez, California. After exploring brain changes during sleep, Dr. Travis returned to MIU as the inaugural director of the Brain, Consciousness, and Cognition Center in 1990, a position he continues to hold. Dr. Travis teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses on brain and consciousness, with which both my wife, Mina, and I have had the pleasure of experiencing during our respective master's program, with me later serving as one of Dr. Travis's teaching assistants during my doctoral studies. He has authored more than 70 papers and book chapters that investigated effects of transcendental meditation practice in 5 key areas. 1, normal child development. 2, ADHD in children. 3, post-traumatic stress in veterans and refugees. 4, brain patterns of higher states of consciousness. And 5, brain patterns of world-class performers. Dr. Travis has spoken globally on the effects of transcendental meditation on the brain and is considered by many to be a preeminent researcher in this field. When not in the brain center, he is an avid tennis player and enjoys a match with his daughters, camping trips with his family, working in his garden, and remodeling his family's home. Dr. Travis, welcome to On Transcendence.
Great to be here, Dr. Baruti.
It's a pleasure to have you. And I must say, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Travis served as my dissertation advisor and mentor throughout the graduate program. And he was, a wonderful joy to have as a mind to bounce things off of and to come to understand more fully the brain and consciousness throughout the entire tenure of my study. So I want to say publicly, thank you for that, Dr. Travis. You were a godsend. I must say that, just clearly say that you were a godsend. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And every teacher treasures those students like yourself who thinks deeply, open mind, penetrates issues, brings up questions, integrates diverse areas. It was really a pleasure working with you, and I look forward to continue doing this.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Well, since you began your research with sleep, I'd like to first begin by asking you, what was it like studying with Dr. Feinberg?
It was a very special time. To give a feeling for this man, he had one of the major models of why we sleep. He thought that when we're sleeping, we're actually metabolizing some substrate that we create during waking. When I was with him, and this was all by following groups of data, groups of subjects. When I was with him, we followed individual subjects over the night, and nobody showed this pattern. It can happen when you look at averaging over large periods of time, over groups, but looking at them individually. So here's a person, he's out there, he's published, his name is tied to a specific model of sleep. And did he cover it up? No. He immediately wrote a paper and he refuted his own model. That's Erwin Feinberg. He taught me what it means to be a scientist. As a scientist, you think deeply and carefully, you construct your research, and then you put all of your preconceptions to the side when you look at the data. Otherwise, you get something called theory-laden data, and you just see what you're looking for. So it was quite a special pleasure working with him.
Now, in terms of working with Dr. Feinberg and the things that you learned along the way, share with listeners your experience of beginning in neuroscience, again, as you mentioned before, working with Dr. Feinberg. But I want to focus on your research in terms of neuroscience and looking at higher states of consciousness and the effect on the brain.
Yes, thank you. It's an important use of neuroscience. Neuroscience is a neutral language. It's a neutral language that people can speak and understand, and it can allow someone who has no experience of a specific state or a specific experience to begin to get some idea of what it might be like. So for instance, for my PhD dissertation, I looked at people practicing transcendental meditation And I compared that with non-meditators just sitting with eyes closed. My non-meditators went to sleep. Now, as after about 3 or 4 minutes, they went to sleep. And sleep is completely different from transcendental meditation. The brain waves, first they become very low amplitude, and then they become very low frequency, going from like 8 to 7 to 6 to 1 cycle per second, and so on. It's very clearly defined in the brain waves. Brain patterns in higher states. What it's bringing out is the value of brain patterns to explore an experience that people have not had. Brain patterns, they're a neutral language. People understand what they signify. And if they see a different pattern of brain functioning, they accept that whatever the person is doing is different than the subjects they've looked at. So this is what I found was very useful. I could speak about higher states of consciousness at Society of Neuroscience. I was sitting in a poster session and presenting what are the brain patterns when a person has completely transcended all thought, all feeling. So it's just wakefulness. It's like the waves settling down to the ocean. What is this experience like? And so we looked. It has to do with the breath is very soft. It has to do with the EEG is functioning in a very systematic, slow frequency. It's alpha 1. It's 8 to 10 cycles per second. Skin conductance is low. So there I am in my poster, and I thought I'd be talking about this. The people that came up, they looked at the poster. They had never seen a pattern like this before. None of the questions were on the neuroscience. The question was, what does this experience feel like? And I was sitting there just completely a little bit amazed, a little bit in awe of what was happening. That with this neutral language of the brain, these people were having an open window into, here's a stable experience which people can have. So that's fundamentally what's been going, because that's one experience within a meditation session. Eyes are closed. It could be for a few seconds or longer. But with regular meditating and acting, what happens is that inner silence begins to be infused into daily activity. And that means subjectively, you begin to have this inner stability within. It's as though you step back from your activity. You're just not as lost in what's going on. And there's a stable, non-changing frame that you're resting against that's supporting you, which is fundamentally who you are. And when this happens, what you see is also the brain waves that we see during TM are seen during waking and sleeping. And so this is another instance of how this experience of the integration of inner silence, outer activity, of the transcendence, which is now a stable part of 24/7. What that's looking at, it's there because the physiology is functionally differently.
Now, you mentioned transcendence, you mentioned consciousness. Go ahead and define for the audience, what is transcendence? What is pure consciousness? And how does this relate to conscious experience?
Beautiful. Well, first, two analogies. One is you have an ocean and you have waves on the top of the ocean. The waves are individual experiencers, individual people. You can also see it as the waves are all of the thoughts that are going through your mind. They're constantly changing. What transcendence is when a specific wave can settle down and experience the ocean underneath. The wave itself is water. The inherent nature of the wave itself is water, and it just experiences its universal nature as the ocean underlying water. And that's fundamentally what transcendence is. That underlying ocean is termed pure consciousness, pure meaning unmixed with thought activity. It's just consciousness, awareness itself. It has a number of shared characteristics of the experience. It's when you have that experience, it's an experience outside of time and space, outside of body sense. The awareness of who you are is no longer just a reflection of the individual nervous system. It's something which is existing. And so most people think about consciousness as conscious of as an individual experience. And what that is, it's a reflection of that ocean of consciousness rising in a specific wave. But we're not that wave. We're not a gender. We're not a nationality, an age, an education. Those are qualities that we have. And these are giving qualities to this underlying field of consciousness, which is our universal nature. And what is that nature? It's a nature to grow. It's what wakes us up in the morning. It's what gives us direction. It's where our attention goes in a situation. We're always wanting to expand. That's who we fundamentally are, and we do it through the functioning of the nervous system.
mentioned Transcendental Meditation, and I always remember my experience of learning TM in Fairfield, Iowa, during a torrential downpour. I'll never forget it. And it was such a palpable experience to me that it drew me in. And it was the first time that I'd ever encountered an academic discipline that fused a discussion of consciousness and looking at it in a true scientific manner. And that really drew me into Vedic science and allowed me to really explore the depths of mind and being and human potential. And so I know how I came to practice TM, and I've never asked you this before. So publicly, I'd like to ask you, how did you come to practice TM?
Oh, it's an interesting story. I was in a theater group, and I wanted to do things like meditation, but it was group living and so on. And so I left. This was in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. I left the theater group. I went up to Boston. I was living actually in Allston, just a couple miles from the Cambridge TM Center, living with a college roommate. And I was reading different books, and my interest was in growth of inner subjectivity. I realized at that time that's what had to be developed. Everything I learned in school was things to do outside, how to behave, how to think, how to do, and so on. But to actually explore the thinker, the doer, who I was fundamentally, I knew that was something extremely important that I wanted to do with my life. And so I was reading Be Here Now and doing different yoga and so on. And so I was sitting, my roommate was a semi-professional soccer player. So we would go to 2 or 3 soccer games a weekend. I still like soccer. And we were at a soccer game, and he had a girlfriend. His girlfriend brought a blind date for me. So we're sitting there, and it must have been quiet because she said, "Do you meditate?" And so I told her just sort of what I told you. She says, "Oh, you should go up to Cambridge and get your mantra." And so I went to the newspaper, okay, Transcendental Meditation, walked in. They talked about using 10% of your full potential. And that really keyed in with my experience. When I was with the theater group, it was summer stock, fall, winter, and spring. We tour up and down the eastern seaboard. We get to a place, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We have to have a show up at 7. I found, and I was in charge, I was stage manager as well as doing acting. And what I found is sometimes it was really easy. It's like there was a checklist. I just had to check it off. Sometimes it was walking through mud and where's the earphones and where's the tools and so on. I really experienced it was more of me there at some time than other time. So in this introductory lecture, when they talked about using 10% of your full mental potential, and that they're part of you which are silent and whole, they're available, it really drew me in. It really touched with that experience. And in my first meditation, just as you said, it was everything just completely settled down. It's like you press the pause button and the mind, everything, all the doing just ended up in being. And there wasn't this turmoil and this activity and the things going on. And it was very whole. And it was me. There was nothing more I could do, nothing more I wanted to be. It was just me and the fullness, this silent state. And so then I came out and I instantly knew I wanted to become a TM teacher after that. It took me a year and a half later, but I did get to go to TTC. That's how I learned.
It's interesting when you talk about it because I can see the moment of reflection for you, of going back to that experience of being at the match and meeting this person, and then the whole process of making the decision to look into this more fully, and then of course the learning of it, and then having that transcendent experience at that next moment, and then knowing unequivocally this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. It's very clear to see you, hear you say it, and to see you say it. I can see that passion, and it seems to me that that then led you into neuroscience in a very direct way. And so, given your experiences with TM and what you've learned about the brain over the years, I remember you said in class one day, this was been 2009 or maybe 8 or 9. You said to me that we know about as much about the brain today as we knew about the heart in the 15th century. I never
Mhm.
forget that, and it made me think about how new we are, and as a species of trying to understand the brain, and how the ancients, some way somehow, cognized that something powerful was happening, and yet neuroscience has, it seems, over the last maybe 20 years or so, begun to move in this direction to ask these fundamentally deeper questions. But your path, it seems, began once you learned TM and brought you into this realm, if you will. And so, my next question is really describe your favorite aspects of neuroscience research.
Well, the favorite aspect is watching the brain waves emerge as a person is sitting there. Because I see the brain, it's the interface between us. We're fundamentally this unified field of consciousness. It's us and the world. And I can't actually look at the unified field of consciousness, but I can look at the interface. And what the interface is telling me is what's going on in this individual. How is consciousness unfolding, looking over time? People having expanded experiences. What is happening? Because the expanded experiences are not made up things in the mind. They're actually how the breath is functioning, how the heart is functioning, how the brain is functioning. And it's not to condense the very richness of an unbounded transcendental mystical experience to cortical firing, but rather the cortical firing is allowing us to look very precisely at the nature of the inner mystical experience. And so to this day, I just sit a bit like a child, looking at the EEG and looking for that pattern underneath. Currently, what I'm looking at is brain-to-brain synchrony. Rather than what's happening in a single brain, we use that to identify higher states of consciousness and how the brain will function differently when people have maintained this inner transcendence 24/7. That inner silence is that constant companion throughout life. What we're looking at now is brain to brain. How does the electrical activity of one point on the scalp of one person relate to the electrical activity of this other person? And it's called collective neuroscience. It's just emerging the last 5, 6 years as the equipment's becoming more accessible and the ability to simultaneously record. But for instance, they've recorded EEG in teachers and in students simultaneously. And what they found is that the student who does best on the test at the end of the day, their coherence is actually higher with the teacher than the other students. They looked at a specific test where they see this open circle and it gets filled in with green, and they give them a competition and a cooperation test. The cooperation is you try to press your button when the circle is completely filled up, try to press it at the same time that the other person is pressing their button. That's the cooperation. The competition is try to press your button first. When the students are competing, brain-to-brain synchrony is very low. When they're cooperating, brain-to-brain synchrony is very high. And I think what this is getting at is we're not isolated classical beings separate from everyone else. We're systematically, in a very strong, real way, connected with other people. And so I'm looking at this brain-to-brain synchrony to see, is this a measure of the collective effects of people sitting as a group and stirring the underlying field of consciousness? And so at the 10,000 course, I have one set of data with people practicing TM, and they would meditate twice. One time the meditation overlapped with when the group of 10,000 were practicing TM themselves. The second meditation is when the big group was practicing the advanced program, the TM City program. And what I'm investigating is the brain-to-brain synchrony higher in these two groups in these two people, when the big group of 10,000 is actually doing the advanced Vedic technology as a TM City program. It's trying to take the collective effect and give us small steps so that science can begin to move with us to understand that we're really intimately connected with the world around us. The second one was with non-meditating individuals, same scenario, but they were just sitting with eyes closed. When I get some findings, I'll tell you and we can actually talk about it.
This is fascinating because it makes me think about a term that I learned many years ago called entrainment, and highlighting how when teams and units work together, there's to use your term, a synchrony that develops within the group, and in other traditions is often referred to as an egregore that's developed among the group and amongst the gathering. And I'm seeing from your recent research that this is taking it a bit further and beginning to ask deeper questions and is beginning to chip away at what I refer to often as the calcifications of our mind that are based in materialism, to have us go beyond that, to recognize the underlying field that is consciousness, a pure consciousness, that we all participate in. And it begins to remove a lot of the specious notions that we have in society of separation, of division, and begins to chip away at that. And as more and more of us come to understand this underlying nature that we all have and can access and cultivate, in this case via TM and the advanced techniques, that it brings something of greater value to our individual lives. But more importantly than our individual lives, it brings something of value to society as well. And so I'm looking forward to definitely reading those articles when they come out, because it lends itself well in where I'm looking to do something with my own research as well. I think it'll teeter wonderfully into that, which kind of gets me to my next question. In your book, Your Brain is a River, Not a Rock, you often talk about, and I've said this in class as well, of how every experience changes the brain. So, in what ways do you see this research that's coming out now, the brain synchrony research? What do you see as happening, not just with the individual, project into the future, say 10 years from now, as research such as this becomes much more widely known, as we as societies begin to embrace this understanding, this fundamental understanding of our universal connectedness? What do you see 10 years hence as a strong possibility that could be made manifest as a result of your work, going back again at our brains being a river and not a rock? Please.
A rich question. Um, First, what I see is world peace. I see we're at a moment of a real transition. And that's because one of the outcomes of the 10,000 course were people in India where the culture understands that the world is my family. And they saw the effect of the 10,000 people coming together. And so these groups are being created. And as the groups are being created, they're going to show their effect. And what is it's in? I think it's the whole human condition is changing. As a race, we're evolving. And we're evolving because of shared experience. Right now, we're talking, I'm in Iowa, you're in Massachusetts. If I was in Taiwan or Africa, we could be talking as well. And I'm sure you've talked with people in those countries, and suddenly someone in Africa becomes a human being with thoughts and feelings. And I think a lot of those divisions, which we've taken on in terms of our thinking, are just dissolving away. And we're beginning to see people as people. And once you see people as people, and then you can't make a decision that's going to somehow jeopardize the well-being of that other individual, because they're a person just like you. Because of experiences now, not only of transcendental meditation, but meditation is really becoming deep into the understanding of importance in modern society. And there's meditation rooms in Google and Fortune 500. The understanding that we're intimately connected, neural theology, that let's look at fundamental issues in theology, but let's look at it in terms of the brain. Why? Because theological religious experiences just reflect what the brain is doing. There's number of thinkers seeing that consciousness pervades the universe. David Chalmers says, okay, the neuroscience has been at a standstill since the 90s. They thought that the brain produced conscious experience. And what they could do is they could explain, okay, here this information comes into my ear, it goes up to the cortex, it's rung back and forth here. They didn't know where that became the subjective experience. It's called the explanatory gap. They're stuck there back in the 1990s. They're still stuck now. And David Chalmers made a bet with Crick, and they bet some fine wine, and David Chalmers won, that neuroscience hasn't made any progress. And the reason is the brain does not produce consciousness. It's just, there's no logical way to take physical activity in a structure in time and space to give rise to something outside of time and space. So David Chalmers says, we need radical ideas. We've been stopped. We've been stopped as a scientific community. And he says, one such radical idea is consciousness is a fundamental along with time and space. Time and space and consciousness is what everything around us is made of. And by consciousness, I don't mean metacognitive reflective processes, but consciousness is awareness of things around you and reacting to their presence. And so in this way, every small thing, even an electron, so electrons going around the atom near the speed of light, it's not sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, here I'm going next to the speed of light. I never get to rest. But what it's doing, it's moving in a very lawful way. It's within that shell, and it's interacting with other molecules in a lawful way. This lawful interaction is what consciousness is. Panpsychism thinks that consciousness pervades the universe. The one point that other people haven't understood is that consciousness exists by itself. And that actually, and what Dr. Nader is suggesting is that consciousness is all there is.
There is. Yes.
And because it's a field of consciousness by nature, it's going to interact with other things. First, it interacts with itself because that's the only thing that's there. This interaction creates waves of interaction. These waves interact and you get patterns of interaction within consciousness. And these patterns of interaction become patterns of energy and molecules and matter and so on. So there's a whole transition in the understanding of the world around us.
Something that I've come to understand, oh gosh, it's probably been maybe 20 years ago now, that not only is, to use Dr. Nader's term, not only is consciousness all there is, but consciousness is the only real game in the universe. Everything revolves around it. Everything comes from that. And so who was it? Benjamin Elijah Mays, past president of Morehouse College in Atlanta, he once wrote, "The circumference of life cannot be rightly drawn until the center is set." The circumference of life cannot be rightly drawn. He didn't say it couldn't be drawn. He said it couldn't be rightly drawn until the center is set. And I liken that to an experience of transcending. I liken it in terms of one coming to recognize the fundamental unity with everyone and everything, and coming to understand it not as an intellectual exercise, but as a direct experience. And then coming to recognize, as DeRope talks about in his book, The Master Game, of moving in the direction of the high games, and the high games being an understanding of, oneself at a deep and fundamental level. And once you do that, you can't but go into the world and reflect that, reverberate that into the world. And that helps to bring about what you were discussing a moment ago in terms of world peace, which teeters for me into what Maharishi did in 1958 and coming out of the Himalayas and presenting this technique, this ancient technique, to the world, and made it possible for us to begin delving into this personally, and then of course moving in the areas of research to try to understand our experiences individually and collectively, which kind of then teeters into my next question is, with the exception of your work at NYU, Dr. Lisa Miller's work at Columbia, and Dr. Charles Stang and his colleagues at Harvard University's Center for the Study of World Religions, what do you see as the delay in making information on consciousness, on spirituality, and human potential much more widely available to not just graduate students, but even undergraduate students and society as a whole? What do you see as the delay in that?
It's just how the brain takes in information. Unfortunately, when we see anything, we have an immediate emotional response. It's called the low road response. It happens in less than 1/10 of a second. It's not bad. It's not, in fact, it's very functional. It gives us an instant global overview. And you can tell instantly, is this safe or unsafe? Should I trust or not trust this situation? Is this for growth? And then on top of that emotion, the brain actually processes the details, and the details come and embed themselves in their emotional response. We don't see things as they are. We don't hear what somebody says. We take all the outside information colored by the immediate emotional response. And our paradigm is part of this immediate emotional response. You hear someone saying, oh, I hear they close their eyes in the cornfields of Iowa. They're in this big building. And you know what? They're going to take care of the Ukraine war. Oh my goodness. These people have taken the blue pill. They're a cult. How can they? Because it completely goes outside of the paradigm. And what it does is it disallows the person to actually think through. And so we don't want to be judgmental. It's just that we all are products of our experience. And what has to have to happen is that person needs to get this information 5 times, 7 times, 10 times, and then they'll begin to look at it. And so whenever and you can tell, it's called paradigm collision. You can always tell the paradigm collision because it's very deeply emotional and it's usually irrational. And they seem to be, quote unquote, overreacting. But what they're doing, they're reacting to the challenge to their fundamental sense of who they are and their right and wrong and sense of self and everyone. So this is, and how do you change a paradigm? You can't change it by talk. Because the words will come out and it's going to go through the paradigm of the other person. They're going to get colored, and that's how it's going to be understood. It can only be changed by experience. And the blogs that you're doing, Baruti, are an experience that people are having. They're following the line of logic. They go to the extent that they can, but the extent that they've gone to is a little bit further and a little bit further. And when they have other interactions with people, when they talk with their children, when they talk with maybe a neighbor, and all these experiences begin to add up, and that's how the paradigm changes. Unfortunately, it seems to be slow. It's not happening in seconds, minutes, years, but it's happening. The whole world in the last 20 years is now embracing that an underlying field of consciousness is fundamental to understanding who we are as an individual, how the world is, and how we interact. It's a huge transformation. Thomas Kuhn talked about paradigms and paradigms moving. And he says that it's not a gradual change, but it's a series of starts and stops and starts and stops. So we're in the middle, I think, of at least paradigm shift, coming to soon a paradigm revolution. I think it's going to happen really in the next 10 years.
I definitely agree with you. And I wrote here in terms of my notes, Thomas Kuhn in his work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And as you were discussing, this podcast and other writings that, myself, you, and all of us do, those are points of contact for the brains of those parties that may be initially resistant to an idea such as this about consciousness being all that there is. As a result of that consciousness being the only real game in the universe, those points of contact, to your point regarding your book, Your Brain is a River, Not a Rock, each of those points of contact causes those initially created connections within the brain to become a bit stronger because the person has an opportunity to reflect on the previous sets of information to which they've been exposed. It then begins to root itself deeply within their awareness. And then they begin to seek out opportunities to have such an experience, to quicken, if you will, that which is resident and always has been within them, which is a beautiful way to think of it because, you can look at it as an individual as you're doing these various things. You're like, am I having an effect? Am I having an effect? And then, of course, when, as in the case of our teaching here in Cambridge, when someone comes through to learn that was initially reluctant to learn TM, but because of a health condition, be that physically or emotionally, they then choose to proceed and learn, there's a fundamental shift that occurs within them. And it occurs because they have heard about it, but they're now having, in this case, the technique of TM, the ability to experience it for themselves. And that becomes, I love what Maharishi would often refer to it as total knowledge. You have that intellectual understanding, but you also have this practical experience. You wed the two, and you then have that total knowledge experience. And I think you're absolutely right that as we continue to do this work, you, me, and a host of others, where these seeds have been planted, that it's going to bring about something that's fundamentally, radically different than what we have at present. And kind of makes me think about Kuhn's point about how science advances one retirement at a time, where we know he was using the word retirement as a euphemism here. But nonetheless, that the work that each of us are doing is basically another brick, if you will, another brick in that wall, that foundation that is going to allow the spires of consciousness to be really built in higher and higher heights throughout the successive generations. And we're doing it now. And it is an honor to be a part of this tradition and to now be one who can participate in a very global conversation on consciousness and human potential, which a couple of questions remaining regarding, you mentioned in your other book with Dr. Harold Harung titled Excellence Through Mind-Brain Development, you focused on world-class athletes. And what has your research on world-class athletes, I'm thinking of the mundanity of excellence and how that helped, kind of cause things to become a bit different in terms of athleticism and how we can all participate this if we're willing to just do the work. What do you see that particular research? How do you see it filtering into society to help others begin to think about their own innate potential?
Yeah, it was very surprising to me. Our initial hypothesis going in is world-class athletes we thought would have more experiences of the zone,
Mhm.
where everything is going automatically, flowing through themselves, their action is perfect, and so on, than the control athletes. And so we looked at people who participated in Olympics, national games, world games, and the world-class athletes were those athletes that finished in the top 10 for 3 seasons. And the control athletes is our athletes who participated, who competed, but did not consistently place. And what we found is, at least for the athletes, there wasn't a difference in peak experiences. But where the difference was found is how the brain functioned. This idea of brain integration. That is, what is the integration of quiet, silence, unbounded awareness as seen by alpha EEG, along with gamma and beta, which are the frequencies of focus. And what we found is that world-class athletes had higher brain integration. This was a measure that we originally derived from people growing towards higher states. And Harald and I were sitting and we're thinking, where else can we see this? It can't just be a meditation thing. We should see it in other traditions and other people. And so the first group is we thought, let's look at successful people. So we looked at successful athletes. Next, we looked at managers, uh, 50 managers. 25 of them had been CEOs for 18 years or longer. Their company had grown. They also had higher levels of brain integration than controls. And again, brain integration is this integration of global and part at the same time. And we asked these managers, okay, what's your secret? And no one said, I worked harder, or they didn't say, I'm smarter. What they all said is they could trust their inner intuition. I thought this is an excellent description of what does it mean to be more in contact with your inner silence, your inner nature. That part of you which is outside of time and space, which is rising up through the physiology to create your thoughts and actions. Because that intuition is a bubble of wholeness that comes up and you can pick it up. We also looked at classical musicians, professional and amateurs. Both had high levels of brain integration. I think this is speaking to the effect of the arts, the music, to refine brain functioning. Also, if you play music as a child, it's known that your brain is connected differently as an adult. There's more right to left connections. And this level of brain integration was about half of that seen in our long-term TM practitioners. And what this reason I'm bringing this up is it shows that what we're talking about isn't a meditation thing. It's a human thing. Every action we take, every decision we make is being imprinted in physical form in the structure and functioning of the nervous system. And if the decisions are for smallness and fragmentation, and then those are the connections that are going to be strengthened. If our decisions are more for wholeness, relating with others, trying to see the big picture, the brain is going to be more globally connected. Transcendental meditation is a huge, powerful force to allow that to develop because you actually settle to that field of silence. But everything you're doing is culturing the brain. That, I think, is the most important take home for that book is we are in control. By our decisions, we're determining the brain circuits we have, and then the brain circuits we have determine how well we deal with the world.
There's a quote that comes from Walter Isaacson's book on Steve Jobs that I happen to love, where he says, I've been trying to find it in the Vedic literature. I've yet to find it, but he says that when Steve was married, the wedding date, they had these little cards on the table, and it said, "For the first half of your life, you make your habits. For the second half of your life, your habits make you." And this
Wow.
teeters beautifully. When I read that quote the first time, and I use it often because it highlights just what you're saying, that the experiences that we have, the things to which we expose ourselves, whether it be when listening to music, playing music, observing art, constantly reading and sharing of ideas and engaging in community with others to understand things at a fundamental level, meditating together, even all of that is helping to really affect who we become as individuals and thus participatory individuals in society and what we then bring to the world. That is something I think that oftentimes people, as Maharishi would often say, knowledge is different in different states of consciousness. And that as we come to understand this much more fundamentally, that you can never, you can't unsee consciousness. Once you've seen it and once you've come to understand it, you have to live your life differently. I say that because in Fairfield, I was waiting for Mina to come out of the meditation hall one day, and there's a tree to the left where the women meditate. And I looked at this tree, and half of the leaves were gone from the bottom, and the other half of the leaves were there. And I
Mm,
recall sitting there just kind of just absorbed in this experience of what this tree was presenting. And then like a flash of just information, that term vishpot in Sanskrit, where this
mm,
information seeped into my awareness that I could fell that tree. And then I could subsequently fell every tree in the area, such that no trees were seen to the eye, but
mm,
I could never impact the law that governs the growth of that tree. I could never touch the law. And so that talked about for me in that moment of this unchanging nature of consciousness and how you can have this materiality in case of the tree can be there and then it can not be there, but consciousness remains. And so this is why when I say that, to kind of, tag on to, if I'm allowed to, what Dr. Nader says, consciousness is all there is. And I just simply say, and as a result of that, consciousness is the only real game in the universe, that once we come to understand that, we can't but live our lives differently. And when we come to understand this interface, I love the word interface. So thank you for sharing that. I'll be using that moving forward.
mm.
This interface called the brain and what it allows us to experience and how that can then show up in EEG patterns and what that then portends for the world in terms of world peace. I think we're at the forefront of something really powerful, very special. And again, as I've said before, I'm looking forward to what we continue to do as individuals, as a collective, to kind of bring that about, not just for ourselves, but also too for those around us, which kind of gets me then into, since we're talking about books, and this is something I'm going to, one of the questions I want to ask guests when they come on to think about this, to share with the audience the top 3 books that left an indelible impression on your thinking such that they then informed your actions and your outcomes. And in what ways do those books shift your thinking, actions, and outcomes?
Well, I'll have to think about that one for a while. While I'm thinking, I just wanted to reflect on the habits and also the importance of people continuing to talk. I used to think I have a father of 3 children, and I used to think my children would somehow get my culture, my right and wrong, what I think is important, and they don't. I had to talk to them about it. And so we can continue to have that inner experience, and that's what is most fundamentally important. But for others to have that, you have to talk to them about it.
Mm.
This is a point about how experience changes the brain. Okay, so top 3 books. Um, probably I'll do one which is a bit of a funny story. Someone gave me The Science of Being when I was a freshman. That's a book that Maharishi wrote about being as an essential constituent of life, and they wanted to know my assessment of it, and I read it through. And I came to the end where it says, the mind's like an ocean, and bubbles rise in the mind, like bubbles in an ocean, like your little icon here. I was a psychology major at the time. I thought, my mind's not like an ocean. Bubbles don't rise in my mind like an ocean. And so I gave her the book back. And that's what I told her. I said, well, it's a nice philosophy. And 4 years later, I actually learned TM. And then I got a copy of Maharishi's book on the commentary in the Bhagavad Gita. That I must have read. I've memorized the verses 4 or 5 times in my life. I've read it through many, many times. That is the one book has probably made the most profound effect on my life, because it's talking about the nature of the individual, the nature of the collective, individual growth of consciousness, your responsibility for dealing with the world around you, the nature of action, what changes as you grow towards enlightenment. It's such a rich book, and that would almost be my 1, 2, and 3. If you're on a desert island, that's the book I would take with me. The second one is written by Dr. Nader, Human Physiology is Expression of Veda and Vedic Literature. And that it's his brilliant, first he's an MD, he's a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, and he's worked with Maharishi for probably 20, 30 years. Mm-hmm. He knows Maharishi Vedic science, he knows neuroscience. So Maharishi called him up once and said, find 8 in the brain. And then he hung up. So now Dr. Nader has the knowledge to actually find 8 in the brain, and he thought very deeply. 2, 3, 4 days, and then he saw that it takes 8 steps. So as information flows through the brain, it goes from a neuron, a cell body, down the axon, it comes to a space, the synapse, continues the action potential down the next. There are 8 of these synapses as information comes in. 8 synapses as the brain is actually processing 8 synapses going out. And that was the beginning. And then what Dr. Nader did is he worked with top Vedic pundits to understand what is the core of each branch of the Vedic literature. And then he took the structure of the book itself, the number of chapters, the number of subsections, and he took what's the quality of that book, and he used that to identify which part of the physiology does that packet of intelligence and that part of the Ved probably relate to. And he did this, he applied this rule iteratively, structure and function of the branch, structure and function of the physiology. He iteratively applied it over and over and over, and he actually tied the 36 branches of the Vedic literature which support the 4 major Ved in terms of the functioning of specific parts of the physiology. That in itself is not a scientific statement, that's model building. And the model building has to be coherent, self-consistent, and it's one rule, iteratively applied. Now the science can be done. What science is you take a model, and the model is made up. It's in consciousness. It's not real. And you project this model out onto the world. You check the goodness of fit. And that's the research that's happening now. What is the goodness of fit of this model? I teach a course where students, and actually you were in this course, Baruti, where you would read through a branch of the Vedic literature for 45 minutes. You'd read it in Sanskrit, so it's just the sequences of sounds. You enliven those sounds in your own self-referral awareness as you read them, and then you close your eyes and you note what's happening in mind, brain, and consciousness. And then you write it down. And as you remember, people were writing down the same type of thing, like Nyaya, which has to do with distinguishing and deciding. And Dr. Nader's tied it with the thalamus, that part of the brain which roots sensory information and wakeful information together. And you really feel it's in my head. This is what seems to be enlivened. And then you read a few more, Sankhya, which has to do with enumerating what are all the different 25 characteristics of every piece of creation. And they don't feel it in the head. They sort of feel it throughout the whole body. The whole body is enlivened. And we go through this and you get the direct experience that these sequences of sounds in the Veda are not a language that's in a book that's on the bookshelf, but they're actually the original pattern of functioning of wholeness within itself. And each sequence is some specific stream of intellectual functioning, of intelligent functioning. It's integrated, it's whole. So that I think is the second most influential book that I read.
Well, I can tell you, I'll speak to all 3 of the books. Number one, I'll begin at the end. And number 1, you mentioned, I recall when I purchased the book, the physiology book on campus, and I showed it to you that day. I was so excited because I found it on eBay, and some people are selling it for a really high amount, and I found it in Nature Supported, where I found it for a really good price.
Great.
And I showed it to you, and you said to me, "There's a lot of knowledge in that book," and so I have to thoroughly agree with you over the years of going through it. The second one being the Bhagavad Gita, Maharishi's commentary thereon. That would be December 2008, when I was in Dr. Agnes's class, Tom Agnes's class, and we were going through it as a part of our experience doing the cities program, doing the advanced techniques. And I remember as we were going through it, reading the various passages, getting into it, which, as fate would have it, occurred during the time that I actually met the woman who became my wife, met Mina during that event, as when she was there for the
Wow.
advanced techniques. And going to the first book you mentioned, The Science of Being and Art of Living, that one, I recall reading that book and just literally being blown away by it. And there's so much of this, there are many passages, but one that sticks out in my mind as I recall the first time I read it is on page 100, hardcover, the early version, the gold with the blue insert. Maharshi says, through the practice of transcendental meditation, one automatically makes full use of one's surroundings. And I
Mm.
recall the incredulity upon reading it the first time, like, how is this possible? But I have to say that over the years of study, over the years of thinking back to that passage in particular, I have to say that what Maharshi is really saying there is that you come to know thyself at a fundamental level. And in knowing thyself at that fundamental level, you begin to engage in right thought, right speech, right action. And as a result of that, your outcomes are reflective of that. And your life becomes reflective of that. And what you shared with us today highlights that our brains become reflective of that in terms of our EEG patterns. And so, what I'd like to do is to encourage everyone who's listening to this to undertake something that's going to cause you to think differently. I'm biased initially, I'll tell you very honestly. I'd encourage you to learn transcendental meditation because it has a tremendous impact, or has had a tremendous impact, on my wife and I and our family, and many, many others with whom we've worked over the years of being here in Cambridge to teach TM and throughout the world. And I can tell you that once you have the experience of transcending, once you go beyond this idea of, oh, my mind can't be at rest because I'm always thinking, once you go beyond that thinking and have this direct experience, it's going to irrevocably change you. And you're going to become a fundamentally different being in the way you think and the way you carry yourself. And I can tell you, because we have this capacity within us as a result of our brains, and we have the ability to create a very different world, not just for ourselves, but also too for others as well. And so I want to encourage everyone to undertake a study of self, and to begin by doing so with, a meditative technique. But I would argue TM is a wonderful introduction to it. And I want to thank you for being here to share your wisdom today, because I've long admired you, and I recall the first time I came in contact with your information, just you as a being, was after I'd heard of TM from Dean Carter at Morehouse. He was just, this was 2006 when Dr. John Hagelin came to speak at Morehouse College. I wasn't there, I was traveling at the time. He came to speak as a part of the Science and Spiritual Awareness Week conference that happens every year at the chapel. And he left a number of his books behind titled Manual for Perfect Government. Dean Carter calls me that fall, I believe it was in October, and first words out of his mouth were, "You need to read this book." And so I said, "Hello to you too, Dean." I then went to his office and secured a copy of the book, I believe the next day, and began reading the book and loved the book. Went online immediately, look up this thing called Transcendental Meditation, and found your video of
Mhm.
you with the EEG demonstration. Dr. Hagelin was also there as well, but the person on whom you were conducting the EEG was Shane Zisman.
Right.
And I never forget, him, because the email that came to me on 11 March 2008 announcing the David Lynch weekend came from Shane Zisman. And so that's why I remember his name. And so nature somehow organized it where it came across my path via Dean Carter at Morehouse. Then of course Dr. Hagelin's book, and then of course going online and finding you. It's just been one of those things that I have to say it is one of the single best things next to education that I've ever done for myself, which led to me, of course, meeting my wife, our family, teaching TM, and everything. So when we hear you say that experience changes the brain, I am certain there are more than just myself will affirm that that is in fact the case. And practical, put this in practical terms, that has helped us to become, just even better people. And I want to say thank you for your work. Thank you for your friendship, your mentorship over the years. You are, and Mina and I say this often, and I believe within African American tradition, we believe in giving people their flowers while they're here. So I want to say that, give your flowers now and just simply say you are a godsend. And what you're doing for the world is sorely needed. And one of the things, when I met Stephen Covey, this was probably 2009, 2010, he said to me, young man, you want to live, love, learn, and leave a
Mm,
legacy. And I
mm.
have to say, the legacy that you're leaving, is so phenomenal. And that you were trained by Erwin Feinberg, and he impacted you, and you have impacted not only myself as a student, as one of your doctoral students, but all the other doctoral students whom you've had. You're impacting them, and your work, your way of thinking, Erwin Feinberg's work and way of thinking will live on in all of us, because you've helped us to become and will continue to become the scholars we're going to grow into. So I want to just publicly just give your flowers now and say thank you for that. And thank you for the honor to be here today. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you for the flowers. And Baruti, it's all of us working together. We're shoulder to shoulder.
Yes.
And I so am happy that you're part of this growing group of people aware of what's important in the world. And you realize that what your life should be is to spread that. So I really enjoy our collaboration. And thank you for asking me to be on your blog.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much,
Yeah.
Dr. Travis.